Well, chaps, we're going to keep this audio, so to speak. I think I might end up keeping this sort of like, shall we say, less visual. Not everyone wants, I don't think would want to see this mug. Anyway, on a proper note, if you haven't switched off already, this is one of my 80th anniversary things that I am doing, and indeed one of the most important nights in London history, in a way really, and maybe even the country's history, as some people apparently, according to Wikipedia, believe that this night ended up contributing really to the fall of the British Empire, owing to the economic ramifications of what happened. What happened then, happened even, being what is referred to in some history books, but no one really calls it nowadays, it seems, the Second Great Fire of London, the night of Sunday the 29th December, morning of Monday the 30th of December, 1940. The raid came on the back of a brief lull over Christmas between Germany and Britain. It seemed to not bomb each other, or at least not to bomb Britain anyway. And Hitler didn't bomb London until the night of 27th of December, which is the day I'm recording this, funny enough. However, all because it's Christmas doesn't mean that Hitler is going to stop the war. Despite the urgings of Gandhi around about Christmas 1940 to Hitler to stop this senseless war, Hitler is obviously by this point not the kind of person that is going to be listening to anyone, be it Gandhi or anyone in Germany, to stop the war. On the night of Sunday, 29 December, it's a crisp, cold day. Well, crisp, cold evening, I should say. Back when this country had proper winters. And the whole aim of what was going to happen tonight was in a way mostly one of terror, what the Germans would later call Terrorfliegers, or terrorist flyers. They knock out the old heart of London, some of which had been around for a few centuries, especially the churches. The odd bit and piece even had escaped the Great Fire of London, because the Great Fire of London ended in the west, at any rate, by Fetter Lane and Fleet, on the end of Fleet Street. So you've got an old building down there, Prince Henry's Rooms. That's still there. One of only two wooden buildings really in London, city of London anyway, to remain from before the Great Fire. And Hitler was able to do something that the Great Fire wasn't, and just do damage all over the place. Though called the Second Great Fire of London, damage was largely insignificant compared to what the Great Fire did. The Great Fire in 1666 destroyed something like 80% of what we knew as London in those days, or what they knew as London. By 1940, the city was merely a small, what we now call the city, was merely a small percentage of Greater London. So a lot had changed in almost 300 years. Around about 5:20, a plot of enemy bombers was detected massing over Calais, like they did during the Battle of Britain and still did during the Blitz. And Hitler, or at least Luftwaffe, were aiming to attack reasonably early in the evening, between 6 and 9 p.m, to get back home before the bad weather set in over the Channel, and indeed over France. So in a way, this raid was one of the earliest in terms of times of day anyway. Round about 6:20, the bombers struck. They had come in after what was called, well, I was going to say organisation, behind a squadron known as Kampfgruppe 100. 10 Pathfinders came in, managed to get past the Ack alright, and then the bombers came in. The bombers were armed with around 10,470 firebombs, history books say anyway. And when they started to release their bombs just before 6:20, something like 300 a minute would be falling onto the streets below. And this was merely the first of a couple of waves. Now, it should be said, of course, that by now, at the end of December 1940, London and other cities in the country, as far afield as Belfast, Sheffield, Glasgow, had been bombed or targeted since at least September 1940, when Hitler made that classic blunder of going after cities and industrial targets rather than focusing, as he had been, on fighter command, and it gave fighter commanders tremendous breather, of course. However, by December 1940, night fighting was incredibly basic. Not many pilots outside the Bomber Command were really trained to fly at night. Not many made a good working of it. Even the legendary Sailor Milan, of which Robert Shaw's character in the film Battle Britain is based upon, was able to get to grips with it straight away. There were adverts in newspapers that said, eat your carrots so you can see in the dark, like night fighter pilots or whatever, and carrots made no difference to seeing in the dark. So, but fighters were up, and as the war progressed, night flying improved tremendously, of course. Bomber Command certainly benefited from this from 1942 to the end of the war, and so did Germany. Germany's had in a way been doing night flying longer, or at least concentrated night flying, and December 29th was a perfect example of it. As I said, the target was largely concentrated on the square mile, and the first beauty of this night is that this was an age where you didn't have mobile phones, you didn't have Twitter and Facebook and everything else, you didn't have the internet. You were reliant on wireless to get your story out and newspapers. And this was particularly true of American reporters. America was still neutral, of course. This was just under a year before Pearl Harbor happened. And in spite of all of Churchill's wishing and urging, Roosevelt was not to budge. He was going to say after this raid, on December the 30th, in a fireside chat, that America was going to become the arsenal of democracy to those fighting the Axis, or the enemies, enemies of freedom. As a way of not going to war. If we could help our allies, then it will keep the threat away from us, kind of thing. So you had reporters like Ernie Pyle, a legendary Ernie Pyle. They did a film about him during the war because he was played by Burgess Meredith. I believe it was called G.I. Joe, funny enough. And Ed Murrah, who was based at BBC Broadcasting House, and indeed had been in the Broadcasting House when it took a direct hit, killed a few people, and he was reporting back home to the States as body bags were being carried past where he was recorded. We say blitz spirit a lot in this country now, especially this year with what's going on with the pandemic and Brexit, indeed. It was not a perfect time. Much like now, you had people that were not doing what everyone else was doing. We have this image of blitz spirit, and indeed Dunkirk being all backs to the wall and helping each other out. And it didn't happen. I read in a book about the invasion threat that came out a couple of years ago, that one army unit or home guard unit was needing to use local buses for troop transport if the invasion happened, and they went to practice it, and one bus driver refused to budge and went home or something, and he got arrested because he's effectively aiding the enemy by not doing anything. And so you had people that were, you had your crime, your murderers, your robbers, your burglars. You had people that were cheating the system, maybe getting an extra bit of rations from the black market, and just generally not playing ball. So there was all that going on. But Churchill, in a way, was quite reliant on these American reporters and journalists, newspaper and radio. Because, as I say, he had been trying to get America into the war, or at least sizable help from the States, ever since he became Prime Minister in May. And by December, though the invasion threat had receded, Britain was still very much on her own in a way. She had the Empire and Dominions helping her out, but militarily, against the might of the Reich, Britain was a pinprick, really. So by 29 December, you had American reporters, as I say, walking around London reporting on it. Quentin Reynolds was the one that termed London can take it, Britain could take it. And Churchill wrote in his second volume of his 5-volume memoirs of the war that the American public had been listening to these broadcasts of all these people and were tremendously on side with the British. If people think Boris Johnson can spin stuff, Winston Churchill made an art form of it, and he had to. Britain needed help. And if that had all fallen through and Hitler had never intended to invade Russia, Britain probably would have been invaded in the spring of 1941, if he had the means to do so. Ernie Pyle wrote, or indeed broadcast on Christmas Day 1940, the following: "The attitude of the people is not one of bravado. It is no self-injection of do or die for dear old Siwash. It isn't flag raving or our own sometimes silly brand of patriotism. In fact, I've never seen or heard the word patriotism since coming here. No, it is none of these. It is simply a quaint old British idea that nobody's going to push them around with any Larsen success." End quote. And I think that's one of the best quotes of the war, really. It much better sums up the British attitude of the day. Nowadays, I wouldn't say we don't like being pushed around. We have our own brand of patriotism. We don't really put our flags on everything. But it's not. We've let ourselves go, I think. So the bombs are falling and they're attacking in waves. And there were some people, apart from the Ernie Pyle, there were of course other people walking around. And there was a reporter back in the day called Leslie Mitchell. He features in a couple of films in the 50s like Genevieve. And he worked with British movie tonos. And as part of the Imperial War Museum's fantastic archives, or a collecting of archival recordings of people's experiences, he said on that night, "I was working at Bush House," which is, by the way, on Aldwych, and is now home to King's College London, on the night of December 29 down by the Strand. And we were told that there was a tremendous blitz on, and we better not go out. But we managed to persuade the man to let us onto the roof, and the whole of the Fister outside was fire. St. Paul's appeared to be on fire. The line along the Thames was on fire. That was the warehouses. The city was well ablaze. It was a very frightening sight, because one really believed, now we've had it. And that's how bad it was. Britain, this was not the worst raid of the war. May 11th, 1941, the last raid of the war, well, the last raid of the Blitz anyway, was the worst, and there were worse before in November. But Hitler was concentrating upon the city. Now, Bush House, as I say, is on Aldwych, which is on the end of the Strand, and the, sort of like the City of London limits are about, we'll say, a quarter of a mile east of Bush House. So he had a good old eyesight, and if he could see the warehouses, that used to be either side of the Thames, up to Tower Bridge, then it must have been god-awful. And a lady called Mary Warshauer, who was working for the Air Ministry, which is now the Ministry of Defence, said, my boyfriend and I went on to Westminster Bridge, and though it was pitch black, everything was silhouetted in red, but the bit that got me was the river. Everything was reflected in that river, and it wasn't a river of water, it was a river of fire, and it was alive. It was a combination of horrendous and beautiful and magnificent. London was taking it, but London couldn't take raids like this much more often. 8 Christopher Wren churches were burnt or destroyed in the Second Great Fire. Nowadays there's only something like there's about 70 left, and all in various states of repair. And of course the most famous one is the cathedral, St. Paul's Cathedral, which stood on the top of Ludgate Hill now. This current version since 1710. And it's the 5th one since around about 640 AD. Hitler, I think, was hell-bent on getting anything that was unique to British identity, be it HMS Fitzroy, which the Germans claimed they bombed if not destroyed at least 3 times, HMS Ark Royal, which they eventually got in 1941, and St. Paul's. As in the First War, there were men based in the dome of the cathedral, known as the Fire Watchers. And these were incredibly brave men in their way, especially in this day and age of magnesium flares and the like, and one got through the dome, which they put out rather quickly. The incredible thing is that the church was still going on with Christmas. There was a lot of people in the crypt taking shelter, and the incredible thing about that is that if a bomb hit above in the churchyard, they would have been killed. The gap between the ground and the crypt really was no more than a few inches in places. And obviously you had the underground nearby. Also the River Fleet, which still running under Farringdon Road into the Thames. It wouldn't have flooded St. Paul's, but that would have posed some considerable problem. One source states that afterwards 22,068 firebombs were dropped by 136 planes. Aside from those when churches, the Old Bailey was hit, but the Old Bailey still stands with its scales of justice atop it. The only difference is nowadays is that you've got those hideous modern 2008 line burner road buildings in the way, so you can't see it from Fleet Street on a tour bus. The Guildhall, which has stood now for nearly 1,000 years, was also hit. Daily Telegraph took damage, but the Telegraph building is still there more or less as it has been since it was built over a century ago. And there were met over 100 tons of high explosive. And this all happened in a space of 3.5 hours. It was a tough night for the firefighters, not least of all because of the fires they were indeed dealing with, but the Thames was at an abnormally low tide. It was one reason why the Luftwaffe attacked on this night. With the tide what it was, the firefighters were struggling to get their hoses away from the river in a way to deal with the fires in the city. Incredibly, one source I read says at least 12 people were killed in this second Great Fire of London, a couple more than what was killed in the first Great Fire of London. Overall, by the end of May 1941, around 40-odd thousand Londoners had died in the Blitz. A small fraction, really, to what the British and the Americans dealt to the Germans between 42 and 45. It was the raid of December 29 that Arthur Harris, Air Chief Marshal of Bomber Command, was watching, I believe it was from Per Astra House or Ad Astra House on Kingsway, and said that the Germans had sown the wind and now they were going to reap the whirlwind. And it was one reason why the bombing campaign by the British certainly was so ruthlessly driven in places, and why we're still really castigated by people of conscience, I suppose. That's not to say we had the British of the day had no conscience, but Bomber Harris was just sheer relentless. He was so single-minded and doggedly determined to get Germany back for this, the Blitz, that he wouldn't budge. I mean, when he was he was told effectively by Eisenhower in 44 to help support the invasion that was going to happen, concentrate Bomber Command against targets in Normandy in France. He refused. He was not happy about it. He effectively refused. Even Churchill thought later on that some of the bombing raids were far too great and damaging. And as I forget who it was now that said, it might have been Max Hastings in his book Chastise about the Dam Busters. Or at least a book I've read this year. I've read so much. Dresden was not as bad a raid as Hamburg. What makes it one of the most iconic and devastating things in human history is that it happened a couple months, if not a month, before the end of the war. So the war ends, everyone is taking stock, and there's these images of a beautiful city devastated, with its centuries-old church devastated, or its cathedral. Whereas Hamburg was a more relentless raid. Britain hit it first, America then hit it during the day, Britain hit it again. The temperatures were so hot, people were on their hands and knees in liquid tarmac, burning alive. So Britain got off lightly, in a way. If the Luftwaffe had, pre-war, had a more long-term mind to strategic warfare, there was a chap who died in 1936, I believe, who was steering the Luftwaffe to having a long-range bombing force and all the rest of it. Things could have been massively different, but the Luftwaffe never really had a proper full-engine bomber, certainly not for 1940. They never had a bomber in mind to get to America. They started developing one around about 42, 43, seriously. So the night of December 29 could have been much worse if pre-war Luftwaffe had gone a different way. But those great feats of heroism that night. Firefighters and civilians coming together to help one another. Churchill was constantly on the phone, is St. Paul's still standing? Is it still standing? And at one point, Ed Mower, as he walked around, thought St. Paul's was destroyed because he couldn't see it. Ernie Pyle said that the dome of St. Paul's at one point reached through the flame like a soldier to a soldier on the battlefield. But the most incredible image of the war, really, is St. Paul's Cathedral. And it's not even of the war. It's surely one of the most iconic photos, images in human history. Herbert Mason was, I believe, chief photographer at the Daily Mail. And whatever we think of the newspaper nowadays. He was a fire watcher. Now, the Daily Mail would have been based on Fleet Street, and I believe that building is not even there anymore. Most of it got demolished after the journos moved out in the 80s. But he would have been perilously close to St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's would have been just up the road, and he was waiting and keep an eye on things, and he must have been surrounded by smoke. And then all of a sudden St. Paul's pokes its dome, and some of it's building through the smoke. He takes a picture that's called St. Paul Survives. Sheer opportunism. It was an incredibly lucky photograph, and it was beamed all around the world in the technology of the day. It's one reason why this church remains iconic. It's more than a place of worship. It's a symbol of Britain. Not in a flag-waving way, but just in the sense that Britain is here. Britain took it. And it will always be here, God willing. It's only been here 310 years. And I say only, the church that it replaced, that was destroyed in the first Great Fire, had been around a good 400 years. And it's down to the fire watchers inside and the firefighters outside. And if you head south of St. Paul's towards Millennium Bridge, you'll see the memorial dedicated to all those firefighters that died fighting the fires, and those who of course lived to tell the tale. And these men are incredible. A great example of Britain that hasn't really changed since then, in the sense that when Dunkirk was happening, and indeed the fall of France started to unfold, these firefighters were called army dodgers, or they were it looked like they were chosen it to not go to war. Some of them did it as a part-time job. You had auxiliary firefighters. Some of them were women, actually, and there were some of them were older, too old to be fighting, so 40s, 50s, 60s maybe. They weren't, and then the Blitz starts, and these men are heroes. The heroes with the grimy faces. Only in this country, really, do you get that. And coronavirus has shone a light on it. We haven't got firefighters now, but we have the NHS as these heroes with grimy faces. But St. Paul stood. And the funny thing about it, I suppose, is that image, I think, when I was last in St. Paul's gift shop a few years ago. I can't find it online at the moment. Their gift shop website's a little bit difficult to navigate for me anyway. That image is on plates and dinner mats, or whatever you want to call it, and tea, anything and everything. Like Churchill would be positively tickled, and also hoping to make money out of it, to see his face and image on anything conceivable. I think you can even get a toilet seat lid anyway with Churchill's face on it. Certainly, I've had an advert on my Facebook feed where I can have face masks with the lower portion of famous people from history, like Wellington, Napoleon, Churchill. Not Hitler, thankfully. That would be quite something, wouldn't it? Walking around with Hitler's face on you, just winding people up. I'm not saying I would buy a Hitler face mask, but I'm just saying it would be, in this town, it would go down quite well, because no one's got a sense of humour in this town. But as I say, the important thing is, in conclusion, he says, this is one of my longest ones in a while, Britain made it. There were more raids to come, more hardships to come. It was a propaganda success. Churchill was pleased to see how the Americans reacted. Now, it's not to say he was pleased at the carnage, by the way. He was not that much of a savage as people make him out to be. Either way, those American reporters and other reporters from the so-called free nations of the world were able to convey the photographs, the words, the sound of this night to you around the world that were not occupied by the Nazis or Japanese or the Italians, and say, Britain's taken it. They're still fighting on. And it might have stirred some people in America, maybe, to say, right, I'm going to go over and fight for Britain. I mean, certainly early in 1940 and into the summer of 1940, there were Americans who came over to fight in the Battle of Britain. They had to be Croat Canadians to fly, because of course America is neutral. Some of them had to go over the border into Canada, to come here. You had people who came from all over the Commonwealth, as it's now called, to help out in the Battle of Britain and otherwise. You had the free nations, the free French, the free Polish, the Czechs, the Dutch, the Belgians, anyone and everyone. You even had some Germans that had fled Hitler before the war started. So that as a propaganda piece, December 29/30 was incredible. As far as London went, it was devastating. Hundreds of buildings damaged or destroyed. Some of the greatest casualties were by St. Paul's. The buildings on Ave Maria and Paternoster Row were destroyed in this night. Paternoster Row, since the First War, was where book warehouses were and other book depositories, and something like 6 million books went up in smoke. And nowadays, if you look at Paternoster Row, what you see just top above St. Paul's is vastly different than what would have been there in 1940. For a start, when they cleared out the bomb damage, they built something that was quite different to what we have now in the 60s, and then it got demolished and rearranged, I believe, in the 90s, and been added to, and it's more famous, though nobody knows it's in Paternoster Square by name, where the First Dates restaurant is for Channel 4, and often a beautiful Christmas tree and several smaller Christmas trees, but I didn't get to go there this year. Now, the King said, out of this there was a growing harmony which we must take forward. And indeed, after the raids, the hundreds of fires were dealt with, Churchill toured the city. And there were tears in his eyes. He was always riven by emotion. But he was startled by the fact, as he was in the East End, in Manchester and elsewhere, that the people cheered him and shouted, "Give it back to them. We can take it. Make sure they pay for it." And indeed, young men that had been personally affected by the Blitz joined Bomber Command. Although the trouble with Bomber Command, once you got through all the training, you had been in training for almost 2 years, I believe, so anyway. That was my best effort to give you December 29/30. I apologise it's taken so long. As I say, my YouTube analytics suggest that people give up in the first 2 minutes. I have a top 10 past 7-day video thing on the YouTube studio page, and it shows you the watch time, and as I've said in another video, it seems people watch anything between 20 seconds to a minute and 20. So YouTube fame even, it's not happening anytime soon. After this chap's been, where are we now? 1941. I think the next likely big anniversary video would probably be, well, we'll say at the moment the last night of the Blitz in May 41. But I'm sure, I believe that, and then we'll have the Bismarck and the invasion of Russia and everything else. So thank you for paying attention, or not, and tell your friends, or James Holland, or Anthony Beaver, Max Hastings, so they can say this is not how you do it. But I admire those men greatly, so even criticism I think would be quite good. Happy New Year.